Hello, hello. This is Marlon Weems here, publisher of the Journeyman newsletter. And I was just thinking today, it has been a little over 5 years since I started this newsletter on Substack. Time really flies, as they say. At any rate, it is a newsletter that explores what I call the intersection of politics, the economy, anti-black racism. I think it all sort of, melds into each other. And, it's part of American culture. Seeing a lot of friendly faces here, or, well, not seeing your faces, but seeing your names pop up. So I'm glad you decided to join me for this little experiment that I'm going to attempt. And I tested it on my daughter last night, so I'm sure that's the toughest audience that I'm going to get, probably. Um, while everybody's coming in, maybe just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're not already a subscriber, I've left this open to the public, so you don't have to be a subscriber to join in. And hopefully, you will enjoy what you see enough to go ahead and subscribe. If you're a subscriber and want to support the type of work that I'm trying to do, which is all of the things that I mentioned, and this is just a little bit of a, what's the best way to describe it? A detour. So we don't have to talk about what a certain person did on Air Force One today. We don't have to talk about Ford saying that they're going to lose 1.5 billion because of tariffs. We don't have to talk about any of that stuff. We're going to talk about something a little bit different. Thank you so much, Ann Smith. I appreciate you being a paid subscriber. Um, if you're not one, for the rest of the month, the price of a paid subscription is a little bit less than normal. I've discounted it by 20%. So that's something you can certainly take advantage of if you want to support it that way or support the newsletter that way. Also, there's a link in my bio, and this is something that more than a few people requested that wanted to support the work, but didn't really want to get pinned down to a monthly subscription. So there's a link. Buy me a coffee. I like coffee, so I would certainly appreciate that. And with that, let's get going. So as I said in the post earlier today, and I've mentioned this a few times, and I think even in some of the essays that I do, that I guess about 3 years ago, I started working on a memoir, and it's unlike the little 1,000 word essays that I normally do. Um, it's hard. It's hard work, and it takes for someone like me who doesn't want to write something that turns out to be incorrect. It takes a lot of research, and because most of the things that I'm talking about happened 30, 40 years ago, a lot of the people that I might consult or try to interview are no longer with us. So, there's that. And then there's, of course, my memory. I, it's funny how the way we think of things now may or may not be exactly like it actually happened, but you remember it a certain way. So I thought that it might be interesting, even though I sort of allude to in different pieces that I've written certain parts of having worked in Arkansas back in the starting in the early 80s. I don't really go into much detail about how it is that I even ended up in finance. I have mentioned before, I don't have a college degree. Certainly don't, didn't. When I was in college, I was not, finance was not my jam. So I won't go too deep into it, but suffice it to say, it was a lot of, I guess, what you'd call serendipity. Um, My parents had just gotten divorced. My brothers and I were well, I'm one of 4. I'm the oldest of 4, and all boys. And we were living with our mom, except for one who was playing for the Arkansas Razorbacks at the time. And my next door neighbor was a young white guy, um, newly married, had a brand new baby, and then a toddler, I guess. And long story short, he took a liking to me. The business that I was in was a sort of a sales business over the phone. And I think encouraged is probably putting it lightly. He saw something I did not see, and he browbeat me into accepting an interview. And that interview led to me going to work for a firm that was a startup, kind of a fly by night operation in retrospect. And I worked there for, uh, I guess, 6 months to a year, realized it really wasn't where I was going to be able to make a career. And then I got lucky again, and I was able to land a position as a mortgage backed security salesman. We would call it a trader today, but back then you were considered a salesman. And the interesting thing about it is, I learned the mortgage backed securities business at the fly by night firm. And it was a very new industry. If you've ever seen, um, movies like, I guess the closest thing would be, or if you've read Liar's Poker by Michael Lewis, it talks about that point in time. And we were one of the few firms that were selling that kind of security. So, um, I parlayed the little firm that, wasn't quite on the up and up into a job with what I would say is still one of the preeminent firms in the country as far as regional firms go. And the name of that firm is Stevens Incorporated. I don't think I've ever mentioned the firm by name until now. Um, Not for any particular reason, but that is where I spent the next. So from the summer of 1984, pardon me, until 1994, that is where I worked. And I always tell people that um, that is really where I learned the business. And if you think about, of course, everything's done differently in the South. So I learned a way of doing business that's probably out of fashion now. It was, you don't draw a lot of attention to yourself. It was a very conservative firm. And I mean that not so much in the sense of political party, but just the way that they did business. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that firm because it ties into the sort of the bigger story that I'm trying to get to. And I think since I've never really mentioned it, maybe it makes sense to spend a few minutes just kind of talking about that company. So Stevens was founded in the 1930s, in 1933. And I went to work there in 84, as I said. So they were celebrating their, I think, 60th anniversary right at the time that I joined the firm. One of the interesting things, if you think about it, is the idea that someone started an investment bank in one of the poorest states in the country in the middle of the Great Depression. So there's actually another story that can be told about how that happened. But suffice it to say this: it's still a family-owned business, believe it or not. It's one of for its size, I would venture a guess that it's probably one of the few firms of its size that is still privately held. It's never been a public company. It was started by two brothers. Actually, started by one, and then the second brother, um, who was in the military or in Annapolis, joined later. The brother who started the firm was a guy named Wilton Stevens. Everybody called him Witt, Witt. And some of you may be familiar. If you spent any time in the South, you would know some of the story. But Whit Stevens was a legendary character. And to me, I don't know, possibly the most interesting part of his story is that the man died a billionaire, but he did not have not a college degree, not a high school diploma. As far as I'm aware, I think he graduated from the fifth or sixth grade, and that's it. So just think about that. We're talking about a guy who graduated or who left school in the fifth or sixth grade and ends up being a billionaire. Um, he was always a salesman, and for a time, he was literally selling trinkets and belt buckles and this kind of thing during the war. He's selling stuff to soldiers. But his father, and this is a family about as poor as you can imagine. They were from a town called Prattsville, Arkansas. And Prattsville, Arkansas, I mean, you've heard the expression dirt farmers. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So that was his family. But his father was a state senator. As such, his father was on a committee that during the Depression, everybody expected all the bonds, municipal bonds, school bonds, bonds that states issue to default. I suspect this might be called insider trading now, but that rule didn't quite exist then. But his father had a pretty good idea of the bond issues in the state of Arkansas that were going to pay off 5 years, 10 years from now, or from that time. So, as the story goes, Whit Stevens pulled together $25,000 and started himself an investment firm. So, just kind of put a check mark behind that or next to that. A person without a high school diploma somehow gets a hold of 25 grand in the middle of the Great Depression. So, there's that. And that is how what became Stevens Incorporated got started. And I'm not really telling tales out of school. This is a story that was told to me by, like I said, I worked there for 10 years, so I got to know the history pretty well. When I send out a recording of this episode, I'll put the appropriate links there, and you can check me yourself. So fast forward to the time that I worked at Stevens, I actually knew this person. I mean, I met him. We weren't friends. I wasn't in his league, but he was still working at the firm when I started working there in the mid 80s. And so there came a time that, and this is not unusual. Investment firms, you have companies that are looking to raise money and they come in, they do, what we call a dog and pony show and tell you how great they are. And then, you take notes and 9 times out of 10, nothing comes from it. But this occasion, actually, a company came in, and the name of the company was, well, we won't get into that. I'll save that. But the point is, they had a pretty good presentation, and what they were talking about was phone systems and the opportunities. And this was during a time, if you're old enough to remember, that you didn't have to just get your phone service from AT&T. There were these independents that were popping up all over the place. The WorldComs and all the other names that have faded into dust and are no longer around. And so, yeah, it sounded like a good idea. And as it turned out, sometime later, maybe 6 months or so, Stevens decided to do what was then their first big corporate bond deal. The firm was really known for doing municipal financings. So, I mean, and they were really significant in that regard. If you remember the Superdome in New Orleans, um, Stevens Incorporated founded or raised the financing rather for the Superdome, which at that time, I think it was close to a $500 million deal. At that time, it was the largest financing that one individual investment firm had ever done. So they had, some deep pockets and were certainly able to do deals. They just had stuck to municipal bond deals, primarily. That was sort of their thing. When I came on board, they sort of expanded into mortgage-backed securities, but even so, that wasn't they weren't really trying to take risk on that kind of thing. So for them to do um, this particular financing was unusual, and it was a $300 million corporate bond issue for this company that had just a few months earlier come in and pitched their business. What was even more interesting about it was the fact that Stevens Incorporated was what we call the lead manager or the book running manager. And what that means is this: if you've ever seen a prospectus, or sometimes you see what they call a tombstone, if you're going through the Wall Street Journal, and it lists a deal and then it tells all of the different investment firms that have been involved in it. And the higher up you are on the list, the more sway you have in the deal. The book running manager is the firm that basically controls everything. They control who gets bonds, how the money gets split up, so to speak. And I'm oversimplifying, but that's the gist of it. So Stevens had never done anything like this. So the sales force was kind of ill prepared for it, um, because it just wasn't our focus. I was still new enough there that I didn't care. I just wanted to make money. I wasn't a muni guy, so it was something that I was interested in, but I didn't really have any customers. What happened was, and I guess the reason that I even started thinking about this story is that I was working on the manuscript, and I'd kind of gotten to this part of it, and it, as it turns out, was, I guess, my first really big trade that I did. Um, and there's more to it, but it's kind of irrelevant for this conversation. But the point is, I ended up selling like 10% of this deal by myself to a client I'd never talked to before. So lucky, needless to say. So as I was working on this in my manuscript, the way I like to the way I'm trying to tell the story, the way I'm writing it is, I think it's, my story's interesting, but I think to put everything in context, you kind of have to tell the history around it all. So, yeah, I made a really big sale, but I think it's interesting to think about, why is it that a little bitty firm in Little Rock, Arkansas would get the opportunity to do something like this? I didn't mention it, but they were the lead manager, but the co-managers, so Stevens is here, the co-managers right here who have to pretty much take orders from Stevens, so to speak. One was an enormous Japanese firm, and the other one, a name that's sort of, gone to the ash bin of history, Merrill Lynch. But at that time, Merrill Lynch was a big deal. So for us to be above Merrill Lynch was strange. And so as I'm writing this, I started to dig back, and I knew a lot of the story, but I really wanted to go back and understand how something like this could happen. One other thing that I guess I haven't mentioned, even though at that time Stevens was a little bit over 60 years old, they only had one office in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm I can't even stress how under the radar this firm was. And that was the way they liked it. So to understand why something like this would happen, you really have to go backwards a few decades, back to the late 30s. And so, as I said, in the late 30s, Whit Stevens starts this firm under some unusual conditions, let's just say. Around the same time, there are these two brothers in law. I'm going to say brothers from here on out because brothers in law kind of gives me some trouble. for some reason. And these two guys were basically construction workers for Southwestern Bell, which is one of the old, I guess I think we used to call them baby bells, when um s- they when I guess it was AT&T got split up, and there are all these different bells all over the country, Bell systems of phone companies. So they went to work for Southwestern Bell. Um and over, I think, a period of maybe the next 10 years, they got trained in engineering, certainly construction. They got to understand the way the whole phone architecture was laid out. And at some point, these two brothers decide they're going to strike out on their own. And basically, they're just doing contract work for little phone systems all over the Arkansas region. At some point, they start doing business with a company that represented a county in Arkansas. The name escapes me, but again, I'll provide all this information. And that little, I think the phone system uh, just so happened to cover the area of Prattsville, Arkansas. I think they had a grand total of something like 240 customers that had telephones. As it turns out, the owner of that little phone system was a guy named Whit Stevens. Whit Stevens had bought this little phone system or phone company for $25,000 in, I want to say, 38, 39, 40. By that time, remember the part that I said about his dad knowing when all these municipal bonds were going to pay off? So, what Whit Stevens did when he started his brokerage firm with $25,000 was he basically went around and he bought up as much as you could buy for that amount of money back then. Because of the Great Depression, municipal bonds in Arkansas that nobody thought were going to pay off were trading at like 5 cents on the dollar, 10 cents on the dollar. So think about it. It's like you buying a dollar from me for a nickel and going to the bank cashing it in for 100 cents. What happened was, years over time, these bonds paid off. So by the time he buys this telephone system, he's a millionaire. And we're still kind of still in the Great Depression era. He's one of the richest guys in Arkansas by this time. So he buys this little phone system for $25,000, and he had an ulterior motive. His family is living on this farm in the middle of, you know, poor ass Arkansas, and there are no telephones. So this guy bought an entire phone system, a phone company, in order to run a phone line from his mama's house on the farm so that he could be able to talk to her from his office in Little Rock at the investment bank. So he hires these two brothers that have left Southwestern Bell to manage it. And he says, look, I'm not going to pay you anything. I'm going to give you this job, and whatever the profits are, you can have them. So they jump on that deal. A few years later, they realize they've kind of been took because there's really not a whole lot of money in it. Because these people that, they got 200 or so customers, they're always complaining. People's phones, I guess, are getting cut off. It's just a mess. So they want out of it. So they go to Little Rock and they tell this guy, look, we can't do this anymore. And as they're walking out the door, he accepts it, he understands. They turn around and propose to him, you know what? Would you be interested in just selling us this and letting us make something out of it, this phone company? He says, yeah, right on the spot, goes into his office, draws up the papers. He owns all the stock in the telephone company. And he says, I'll sell it to you for $40,000. Now he's bought it for 25,000. So, but you can't get mad at a man for making a profit. I guess you can, but don't waste your time. So they agree to it, but there's a problem. They ain't got $40,000. They ain't got no $1,000. They don't have any money. So, so he says, don't worry about it. I'll sell you the company on credit. I swear this is true, y'all. This is in, I think, 1942. He says, I'll sell you the company on credit with one caveat. My mama's phone bill never goes up. So that's the deal. So these guys with no money, nothing down, walk out owning a telephone company. So they make something out of it because they know the business, and they go out and they're able to borrow money from a bank to start paying him back eventually. The company grows and grows. They start acquiring all over Arkansas, all these other little bitty phone companies that nobody wants to fool with. Then they start going out into the regions and buying up stuff. Next thing you know, they kind of got a big business. So much so that the son-in-law of one of the brothers-in-law, they bring him in. He ends up becoming president of the company. The company gets so large, in fact, they are, I believe, the first telephone company in the country to do person to person long distance, where you don't have to have an operator in the middle. They're like the first company to ever do this. And in Arkansas, they were the first company to sell people, like the touch tone phones, not the rotary, but the touch tone phones. So fast forward, these guys start getting into, well, what they start doing is they start swapping out all these old phone systems. And I don't know how many of you folks are from or have lived in rural areas where you know about farming, but we're talking about these old phones that would be connected to like a fence, for a farmer that's out on the back 40 to be able to call and talk to his wife and see what's for dinner or something like that. They start swapping all this stuff out, upgrading and so on, and making more acquisitions until they get big enough that they go back to Stevens and say, hey, we're ready to really enter the big time. So Stevens says, why don't you come on in and talk to my salespeople? The son-in-law of the brother-in-law is the guy that came in and talked to us that day. He's a guy named Joe Ford. The name probably won't ring any bells with any of you. A little bit after they came in and made this presentation, they ended up buying or merging with another company in Ohio. Now, what they did when they bought, as they started acquiring all these companies, they changed their name. It had been something just nondescript, but once they got all these little bitty phone companies, they changed the name of the company to Allied Telephone Systems, something like that. Allied Telephone was what we knew them as. By the time they did this merger, they had gotten to be, that merger made them one of the largest phone carriers in the country. And as with a lot of mergers, they end up changing the name. So they changed the name of the company, and some of you may have heard of this company, Alltel. So if you had an Alltel telephone, mobile phone, it was, the lineage goes back to these two guys that basically bought a firm on credit. So Alltel, I don't know who your carrier is now, but Joe Ford ended up becoming the president of all of that. It ends up being one of the biggest publicly traded companies. I think maybe they were number 13 in the telecom era. They ultimately went private. That was a big thing back in, I guess, the early 2000s. to go from being a public company to being a private company. And then ultimately, what they did was basically cashed out. And I think it was Goldman at that point that was their investment banker. They'd gotten too big for Stevens. And they ended up selling all of their assets to another company I know you know, and that would be Verizon. So basically, those country boys down in Arkansas that bought a firm on credit, grew it and grew it, handed it off to their son in law, who handed it off to his son. And now it's part of Verizon. So that's kind of the story. I would like to go into a lot more detail. Maybe what I would do is, um, I think if you have some questions, because I mean, I certainly had a lot. Maybe we can take it to the chat room, and I'm happy to spend a few minutes answering questions. So Karen Marie Shelton says, I had Alltel in 1984. So did I. I mean, they were based in Arkansas. And incidentally, the reason that they raised that $300 million that was part of, my big sale that I made was so that they could build a campus. And their campus is or was on the banks of the Arkansas River in downtown Little Rock. They're um, like I said, they're the son of Joe Ford. Scott Ford worked at Stevens and eventually left Stevens and became the president of Alltel. And what happened to Joe Ford? Well, he is now the vice chairman of Augusta National Golf Course. And if I'm not mistaken, the person before him that I'll have to check my facts, but remember I mentioned Whit Stevens had a brother who joined the firm a little bit later. His name is Jack Stevens. I don't know if I mentioned that. And, both of these gentlemen have passed away. Um, I would say this about Stevens. They really, I mean, in retrospect, there had never been anyone at their firm that looked like me that did what I did. So I'm sure they didn't get personally involved, but just the idea that I would have gotten hired there. Um, I mean, I had the numbers, so on paper, it certainly made sense. But I'm not going to kid myself into thinking that there weren't some conversations that were had. And like I said, I got in the door. I worked there for 10 years and learned everything I could. Um, After a few years, I got one of my brothers hired there, and he became the first equity trader that was African American to ever work at that firm. So I give them credit for that. And the other interesting thing is after Jack and Whit passed away, before they passed away, they brought in one of the sons to take over and run the business. His name's Warren Stevens, and if that rings a bell, it's because um, Donald Trump just named him the ambassador to Great Britain. So there's always a backstory, isn't there? So anyway, I hope it's interesting. That's kind of where I come from. I think if this is something that you guys find interesting, maybe we'll do it again. And it's an experiment for me. I'm used to talking about bad news and the economy and things like that. But I think too there's something that we can all learn from these little stories that don't really make the newspaper. I only know about these kind of things because I was just kind of a fly on the wall for a period of time when, um, there were a lot of things happening. There's another story that I had thought about, and maybe next time, maybe what I'll do next time is a poll or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. But there was an occasion where the biggest bank in Arkansas almost went belly up, and it just so happened that the Stevens family owned 40% of the stock in that bank. Which, if you know your history, this was when Glass-Steagall was in effect. So investment firms weren't supposed to own banks. But the loophole was a family that owned an investment firm could also own a bank. And so that was the loophole they worked around. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I just thought it would be kind of fun to take a little bit of a break from just all the crap. I mean, if you get tired of hearing it, I get tired of writing about it and talking about it. And I just wanted to um, talk about something that, I mean, it's not like great news, but it's something that we can maybe get something out of and uh, take our minds off how funky everything is right now. So, um, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop off. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will do it again if so. And I will be available in the chat room. It's a subscriber only chat. So if you're not a subscriber, become one. Um, if you like this kind of thing, in addition to, all the other stuff that we talk about and write at the Journeyman, think about becoming a paid subscriber. I can't even tell you guys how much that helps because unlike Jack and Whit Stevens, I am not a billionaire. I'm not even a millionaire. I should be, but I'm not. So it's all very much appreciated. And I will circulate the recording of this at some point. And again, thanks for dropping in, and I'll see you on the other side. Take care.